All right, guys. Well, this is the joint session with the UCREL Summer School and the Stats Summer School, and we are really thrilled to have Doug Biber with us today talking about the multidimensional analysis. So everything you want is to know about multidimensional analysis. I'm always exaggerating. So it's over to you, Doug.
All right, thanks. So when I go through stuff, I don't know if normally if these are interactive, but definitely in this case.
It can be, yeah.
Okay, well, I would much prefer if I'm like talking and there's something you don't understand to stop me and say, hey, what are you talking about? Rather than just let me keep on talking and then 20 minutes later I find out that I should have talked more about something before. Okay? So I'll try to do confirmation checks as I go along just to kind of make sure everyone's with me. So what I have planned today is an introduction to multidimensional analysis, and I have two main goals. The one is to do more of a conceptual introduction to MD analysis. What the goals are, kind of conceptually what kinds of information you get out of it. Depending on your backgrounds, I can spend more or less time on that, so I'll kind of find out from you at the start here what kind of backgrounds you all have. And then the second major goal is to give you some of the nuts and bolts of how do you actually do this. So if you've actually tried running factor analyses before and tried dealing with linguistic data from the perspective of factor analysis, and there are all these decisions that have to be made that nobody talks about, but they're like crucial. And you see MD studies getting published that sometimes you want to know, okay, well, obviously they weren't aware of these decisions, and they're doing things that could have been thought through from different perspectives along the way. So that's the second part of the talk. And depending on where you all are and what you want me to emphasize, I can spend more time on one or the other. So actually, just to start, how many of you have ever read a multidimensional study? Okay, so that looks like maybe I should spend some time on on what it is and what the point is. Well, I've got two of these, so I'll get out of the way here. Okay, so in the beginning, multidimensional analysis, the motivation for it came out of my own research, looking at speech versus writing, and I was interested in register variation. And this was back in the early 80s. And people, linguists at that time, were talking about the concept of register variation. And they had this idea that it related to linguistic co-occurrence. So somehow there were these co-occurrence patterns among linguistic features. And Susan Irvin Tripp, for example, had this study where she talked about register differences being defined in terms of a set of co-occurring linguistic features that would then have an alternation pattern to a different set of co-occurring linguistic features. So there was this idea floating around in the literature, but there were no quantitative methods that people had been using to analyze those co-occurrence patterns. So they would just kind of, in a sense, make them up. They would say, okay, well, for example, Wally Chafe had a couple of widely cited papers where he said, looks like pronouns go together with hedges, and just kind of look at some text and think that these things went together, noticing that they seem to go together in text, but there was no quantitative analysis, no corpus analysis. Those ideas just weren't there. Now, there's one major exception to the generalization I've just given you, and this is John Carroll, who way back in the 1960s even was doing some of this stuff. So he was like way before his time, and then he just got ignored. Basically, nobody said, wow, that looked really useful. And so in the 80s then, people were doing it all based on intuitions. So that's when I kind of came along and I thought, it looks like maybe we could do something from a corpus perspective here. And so the statistical question was, how do you go about identifying those co-occurrence patterns? So how do you figure out what sets of linguistic features work together in text? And that's what multidimensional analysis is all about. So the goals, so identify these major parameters of linguistic variation, so those are the dimensions, and the dimensions are these sets of co-occurring linguistic features. So trying to figure out what are the groups of linguistic features that work together in texts, and by working together from a statistical point of view, that means that they co-occur. Okay, so you get these correlational patterns where these linguistic features co-occur in texts. Okay, so they statistically tend to co-occur across all of the texts in the corpus. Is that kind of conceptually, we're good with that? So that's the main goal. So each dimension is a set of linguistic features co-occur. So how does this then turn around to registers? It's because we get these groups of co-occurring linguistic features, we can then characterize each text with respect to a set of co-occurring linguistic features. And once we've characterized the individual texts, then we can get mean scores for a group of texts. So we can compare different groups of texts where the groups of texts are registers from my point of view. And so you can compare the tendencies for different registers with respect to each set of each co-occurrence set. Okay, and I'll go through and then show you specifically what I have in mind here. The functional part right there. So for me, linguistic features vary because they serve functions. There's this necessary relationship between communicative function and linguistic variation. So this is quite distinct from the normal social linguistic perspective, where social linguistic variation is analyzed in conventional terms, not in functional terms usually. So that you get variation because it indexes different groups, it indexes different situations, but there's not this direct functional relationship. My own perspective is very different from that. I believe that variation, maybe not always, but almost always is functional. So linguistic features vary because they serve communicative functions, and that's why these co-occurrence sets make sense, because a group of linguistic features tend to co-occur in text because they're all serving the communicative functions of those texts. So I'll come back to that, but the bottom line here is that you're not done once you've finished the statistical analysis. You have to do this extra step where you try to account for that statistical co-occurrence in functional terms. Blah, blah, blah. Quantitative similarities and differences. This is just the register patterns. This last one then is that each language is analyzed on its own terms. So this allows cross-linguistic comparisons. So you don't impose the dimensions from one language on another language. Rather, you can deal with each language on its own terms, but then you can look at the patterns across languages and see if you're getting similar patterns or not. So it gives you a new perspective on cross-linguistic variation. Is this too slow? Too? We're happy? All right, very good. Okay, so steps, you build a corpus, surprise, surprise. The corpus, though, ought to represent the discourse domain that you care about. So this whole step of representativeness doesn't go away. It becomes very important. If your corpus doesn't represent what you care about, then obviously the whole analysis isn't going to be interpretable. Figure out what linguistic features you're going to include. In general, you try to include the most comprehensive set of linguistic features that you're capable of analyzing. In my own work over the years, I've spent probably more time on developing my taggers and the programs to do the linguistic analysis than the fact analysis itself. So that part is all hidden here. Now there are so many wonderful tools available for doing grammatical annotation. Here at Lancaster, you guys are totally spoiled with clause that you're set. Okay, that's wonderful. So you build on all that. So you annotate the text, make sure that your tags are accurate. So even with clause, you don't want to just assume that everything it tells you is the truth, especially in more specialized kinds of texts. Okay, then you count all of the grammatical or lexicogrammatical features that you care about. You count them in each text. You norm those counts. I assume this is stuff you've been talking about. Yeah. So everybody happy with that? So you actually have rates of occurrence for these linguistic features in each text. So for this kind of design, have you talked about like these two major design types?
Yes.
Okay, so the design type here is that your observations are the texts. So you characterize each one of those texts, and your variables are all of these grammatical features, and you have rates of occurrence for each of the grammatical features in each text. Right? Everybody happy? Okay, so then factor analysis. So basically, factor analysis is, if you think of correlation, we've talked about correlations?
Not much of it.
Okay, so correlations, if you I mean, just real simply, can I do this? I'll just do it right here. You've done this, is this too boring? No? So say we have nouns and verbs. Well, let me do an easy one first. So say we've got nouns and articles. Okay, that's pretty boring, right? So we've got nouns and articles, and I'm going to plot the rate of occurrence in each text. Okay? So say I have a conversation, and the conversation is here someplace, and this is the rate of occurrence for nouns, here's the rate of occurrence for definite articles, right? And say I have 5 of those conversations, and they're all down here someplace. And then I put in some fiction texts, okay, some novels, and I plot the value for nouns, and here's the value for articles, right? And then I put in a bunch of newspaper texts and say they're here. You know, of course, this is making it look very beautiful, which is not really what it's going to be like, but just for the sake of argument. So here's each newspaper text. Here's the rate of occurrence for the nouns, and here's the rate of occurrence for the definite articles. And then you look at that and you say, well, would you look at that? I could basically draw a line straight through that. That's a wonderful correlation, okay? If you got a pattern like that, you can have a correlation that's going to be close to a value of 1. So correlations go from 0 to 1. A correlation of 0 would be, what would be an example of something like nouns with, I don't know what. But it would look something like this, where there's just no relationship between the two things. But if you have this kind of a relationship where basically knowing the number of nouns allows you to predict the number of articles and vice versa, that's a very, very high correlation. So the reason I'm showing you this is because factor analysis is basically this generalized to a whole big set of different grammatical characteristics. So here we only have 2 characteristics, 2 variables, right? And we see this relationship between the 2 variables. But if you imagine doing the same thing to 100 variables and seeing the way that those 100 variables relate in these kinds of patterns, that's factor analysis. Questions about that? Everybody with me? All right. So that's what this is, 6. So we're identifying those underlying co-occurrence patterns. And that's what I'll show you mostly about. And then we do a functional interpretation of those co-occurrence patterns, and then we can use them to compare the registers. So this is my ultimate goal is comparing those registers, but we're first going to identify the co-occurrence patterns themselves. Okay. So just to give you an example, so the very early ones I did were these studies of general spoken and written registers in English. Couple early papers in the early 80s, and then my book in the late 1988. And so the corpus back then, believe it or not, that I used was the lob corpus. Actually, originally in the early 81s, I used the brown corpus, and then I switched to the lob corpus so that I wasn't confounding British versus American English. And comparing the written lob corpus to the spoken text in the London Loon corpus. So in the 80s, pretty much the only spoken corpus of English was the London Loon corpus, and we were very appreciative to have that. Linguistic features, I went through the Quirk-et-al grammar, kind of making a catalog of lexical-grammatical features that might be useful. Went through other previous research articles on speech and writing, basically trying to get any grammatical characteristic or any lexical-grammatical characteristic that I could come up with that I thought might be useful for describing differences between spoken and written texts. So these is just some of the general categories, but under each one of those, so each one of these things, like nouns, verbs, first and second person pronouns, these are all individual features that I included. Counting the features, so I wrote tagger, and the texts themselves were annotated by the tagger in ways that I'm sure that you've all seen. And then I had other programs that would go through the texts and count the occurrences of these grammatical features in the text. So you ended up with these output files, look kind of like an Excel file, where each row represented information about one text, and each of the columns would be a variable, a grammatical feature where you'd have then the rates of occurrence for that grammatical feature. Okay, so the factor analysis is mostly what I'm going to talk about today. So the factor analysis identifies these co-occurrence patterns statistically. So each, what I call a dimension is statistically just a factor. Early on, I used the term factor, and then people were like, well, what are you talking about, factor? And also it gets confusing between ANOVA and factor analysis. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to make up my own word. So I call them dimensions. And so that's where multidimensional came from. But dimension has no statistical basis. It's just like a Biber basis. So that's where we got that. So there are these sets of co-occurring linguistic features, but in my description of the dimension, this functional basis is primary. So trying to figure out why is it that linguistic features tend to occur in the texts of this corpus. And then because of this, we get these distinctive patterns of register variation associated with each one of those dimensions. Okay, so here's what came out of the 1988 factor analysis. There were actually 7 factors that I extracted, and I'll talk a little bit later on about how you decide how many factors. But I extracted 7 factors in this case. But in most of my descriptions that I've published on this, I really focus on the first 5, because those are the ones that have the clearest functional interpretations. The other 2 are defined by relatively few linguistic features, and they're more difficult to interpret functionally. So I pretty much disregard those last 2 factors. So the 5 that I focus on, these then have these kind of tidy labels that are in quotes. Those are my functional interpretations. So the status of the statistical analysis and the functional interpretations are quite different. The statistical analysis, that's an actual statistical co-occurrence pattern that comes out of the analysis. So those are the correlational patterns. So that has a very solid status relative to your corpus. If your corpus is generalizable, then those statistical patterns should be generalizable. If the corpus is not, then those statistical patterns are suspect. But that's a quantitative pattern. These things that are in quotes, these are my functional interpretations. You might disagree with my functional interpretations, and that's fair game. You should evaluate those functional interpretations. But if you disagree with the functional interpretations, it doesn't make the factor go away. So the co-occurrence pattern is what's there relative to that corpus. That emerges quantitatively from the corpus. Just to then kind of show you what this looks like, I'm going to go through two examples, two of the dimensions, so you can see what a dimension really looks like. So this is the first one. So I'll show you, in the second part of the talk, I'll show you what a factor actually looks like. You'll see the numbers and everything, and what you'd be dealing with from a statistical point of view. This just summarizes linguistically what came out of this first factor. So this is the set. Okay, let me back up here. I kind of skipped a few steps here. So in this analysis, I started with, this particular analysis, I started with 67 different grammatical characteristics, or different lexical grammatical characteristics. And that's what went into the factor analysis. Each factor has some kind of a weighted combination of all 67 of those features. They're just kind of like a regression model in a sense. We talked about that?
Yeah, the data with a regression line.
Okay, yeah. So and how you get the weights. Well, it's kind of the same kind of thing. So every one of those 67 different linguistic features has some weight for each factor. But if the weight gets close to 0, then you say, oh, okay, that's not really part of that factor. I'm just going to ignore it for the factor. And if the weight gets close to 1, then you say, oh, well, that linguistic feature really is relevant for this factor. So what you see here is a summary of for this first factor. So you extract, in this case, 7 different factors. This is for the first factor. These are the grammatical characteristics that had weights, in this case, more than 0.4. Okay, so they had weights that were important for that factor. So these are the linguistic features that we consider in the interpretation of that factor. Is that clear enough? Yeah.
I don't quite understand whether you consider the characteristics first and then do off another functional interpretation, or whether you look at which kind of text had these features quite frequently, and do off the functional interpretation from the texts that are characterized by the features.
Good question. Okay, so what you do first is you do the statistical part, see what's the group of linguistic features that comprises the factor. Second, you then try to look at the features themselves and say, functionally, what do those features have in common? Okay, so what makes them related? And you come up with an initial functional interpretation, which will get revised. So in this case, I look here and I say, oh, okay, there's a whole bunch of verbs, different kinds of verbs. Some of these are grammatical characteristics like present tense. Some of them are semantic classes like these mental verbs. So we've got all these different kinds of verbs going on. And those go together with these pronouns, especially first and second person pronouns. So not third person pronouns somehow, but first and second person pronouns. When I say, well, what happens with first and second pronouns? Well, it's me and you, and we're somehow being interactive. And that somehow seems to be going together with a bunch of verbs. And then I see these different adverb classes, especially with kinds of stance adverbs, hedges and amplifiers. And I say, oh yeah, well, that has to do with the me and you and the interaction, and this is somehow qualifying what I'm saying. And then this was very surprising to me in the beginning. So I'm getting all these dependent clauses, and in the 80s, I'm thinking, why am I getting dependent clauses going together with these other things that seem to be interactive and having to do with what Wally Chafe called personal involvement, so that was a surprise to me. So we've got this big question mark. Figure out why does that go together. So, and then you get contractions, things that have to do with some kinds of reduced discourse, whatever. So the way, let me just kind of take a little tangent here for a second. The way that these factors work is just the way that correlation works. You can get positive and negative. So you get these two poles, and these are actually two sets. Each dimension actually has two different sets of co-occurring features. So this is a group of features that co-occur, all these, what I call these positive features. So what that means is that these features tend to go together in text. So when you get lots of mental verbs in a text, you also tend to get lots of first-person pronouns. Okay, that these features tend to go together.
Do I need, before I go there, do I need anything else apart from post tagging? Do I need semantic tagging?
I'm sorry?
You mentioned semantic tagging or not?
No, I never mentioned semantic
apart
tagging.
from post tagging in my book before I go there?
Well, okay.
What kind of tagging do I need?
What kind of tagging? Parsing? That depends on here. So, okay, this is exactly perfect. So, if you had asked me this question 10 minutes ago, I would have been much happier. So it's really important that before you, and this is true for any corpus analysis, before you jump into any kind of quantitative analysis, any kind of statistical analysis, the linguistic analysis, we're linguists, and the linguistic analysis is primary. And so that depends on what you hope to find out, what your research questions are. And so in this case, with multidimensional analysis, it's really crucial to decide what set of linguistic features to include in the analysis. It would be wonderful to include semantic features. I increasingly over the years, I've done more and more of that from a lexical perspective. So I've included more and more different kinds of lexical sets that have semantic interpretations, trying to bring in more of a semantic perspective. But I've never done true semantic parsing or semantic tagging, just because it's really problematic, I'm sure, as you know. It'll be a great thing to do. So, in general, with multidimensional analysis, you want to include as big a set of linguistic features as you can, because you've got the potential of identifying additional dimensions associated with those features. Is that?
But I can do it without the semantic annotation.
Yeah, my early ones, the only semantic features, well, so the only thing that you might call semantic features in these early analyses were these sets of mainly verbs and adverbs. There may be only verbs and adverbs sets that have semantic interpretations. Okay, so positive and negative. So to interpret these with a normal dimension, you've got these two sets of features, and each one of them represents a group of co-occurring features. So here, this is telling you that if a text has lots of mental verbs, it has lots of pronouns, it has lots of hedges, that those features tend to co-occur together in text. And then this is a second group, a distinct group of co-occurring features. These are what I label here the negative features. I call them negative simply because that's how they come out on the factor analysis. But the same thing happens here. So if a text has lots of nouns, that same text will tend to occur with lots of long words. The same text will tend to have lots of attributive adjectives, lots of prepositional phrases. So that's a second group of linguistic features that co-occur. Everyone with me so far? So why this makes a factor is because those two groups have a particular relationship to each other, which is a complementary distribution. So what that means is that if a text has high frequencies of these, that same text will have low frequencies of these. And conversely, if a text has high frequencies of these features, that same text will have a low frequency for these features. And it's pretty easy to think of what that would mean. So for example, in a conversation is going to have high frequencies of these and low frequencies for these. Or if you think of an academic written text, it will have high frequencies of these, low frequencies of these. Okay, so that's why it's a dimension, because you've got these two sets of co-occurring features, but they have a complementary relationship. We're all okay? All right, where was I going with this? Oh, the interpretation. So I could make an initial interpretation here then, just based on that. But then we're going to go on and check other perspectives here to revise that interpretation. So the next thing we're going to do is what's called computing a dimension score for each text. So the dimension score is a way of basically we add up the frequencies for all of these different grammatical characteristics to get a single score for each text. And you first, did you talk about standardizing scores and things like that?
We didn't talk about that.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. So you make them all the same kind of scale. Okay, you make them comparable scales, and you just can add them all up in a way that each different linguistic feature has the same weight. And you can get a single score for each text where, in this case, if the score is high here, high and positive, large positive, what that means is that that text has very high frequencies of the positive features and low frequencies of the negative features. And if a text has large negative score, then that means that text has very high frequencies of the negative features and low frequencies for the positive features. So you get a score for each text with respect to kind of their cumulative use of those co-occurring features. And once you've done that, then you can get mean scores for each register. And you can compare those mean scores. You can use ANOVA or any of the normal statistics for comparing those mean scores. Okay? So in this case, just to give you specific examples, here we get conversation, very large positive scores. So that means lots of verbs, lots of pronouns, lots of hedges and adverbs. It also means lots of finite dependent clauses. Kind of interesting. I thought it was kind of interesting. And I'll be talking about that on Tuesday, in fact. That's how interesting I still think it is. So you can come back and hear me talk about that. In contrast, down here we get academic prose, official documents, large negative scores. So lots of nouns, lots of attributive adjectives, lots of prepositional phrases, combined with few pronouns, few verbs, few stance adverbs, few finite dependent clauses. So the opposite characteristics. So now we think, oh, okay, does this help us revise our interpretation, the functional interpretation? And we start thinking, okay, well, what's going on in conversation that causes us to get lots of pronouns and verbs and stance adverbs? Well, again, it kind of reinforces this idea of interactivity, of personal involvement, and of producing language in real time. right? You can't sit around and revise your language when you're talking. It comes out of your mouth and there it is. It's part of the text. In contrast, what do we have going on in things like academic prose, press reportage, official documents? Well, we have a very informational purpose, very careful production circumstances, lack of interactivity, usually a lack of personal involvement of the author. So those kinds of considerations then come into that functional interpretation. And then the last step is you go and you look at individual texts. And you look at those particular lexical grammatical features in individual texts just to make sure that this interpretation you're coming up with is what you really see going on in those texts. And you look at lots of texts. In this case, it's pretty easy, because that factor, well, at least now, to me it seems pretty straightforward. It's been replicated so many times over and over and over. But in other cases, it's a lot trickier, and you really have to be looking at text, trying to tease out that functional interpretation. So that's the process of the functional part. Here's an academic writing example where you have basically no verbs, lots of noun phrases, prepositional phrases, attributive adjectives, and so on. How am I doing for time?
It's 40 minutes or 20 minutes.
What do you think? Should I go into nuts and bolts, or?
Other people feel like that, yes. Yeah, you have a lot of notes from the audience.
To go on.
To go on, yes.
So let me skip over this then. So this is just a second example narrative. This is the functional interpretation part, just summarizing what I've been talking about. There have been a ton of these MD analyses. I can give you references later on if you want. Seem to be cross-linguistic. What I'm nominating is universals that have come out of these studies based on analyses of different languages and so on. The one is that pretty much every study comes up with a narrative versus non-narrative dimension, so something very basic about narration, as opposed to, for example, the other rhetorical modes that don't necessarily come up. And then this very first dimension that I was talking about, the oral versus literate, it comes up in every single language. It comes up pretty much in every single discourse domain where there's something really fundamental about that parameter. Okay, so some nuts and bolts, just to kind of give you some sense of how you go about doing this. So this actually relates to the question about the semantic tagging. So this whole thing of choosing the linguistic features. So you want to be as inclusive as possible. But there's this kind of like secret thing that we don't really talk about with factor analysis. But we do talk about it with factor analysis, but linguistic factor analysis is unfortunately way more complicated than most factor analyses. So in a normal application of factor analysis, a normal application in our field would be something like you give a bunch of tests to your students. You have a reading test and a writing test, and maybe a grammatical error. You evaluate for grammatical errors, and you have these discrete variables that are clearly different. And maybe you give a battery of like 12 different tests, and then you put them into a factor analysis and you see how those tests relate to each other. And you say, oh, look, reading relates to writing, but it does not relate to listening and speaking or whatever. Okay, and you come up with these different parameters. And it's pretty straightforward because your reading score is clearly something different from your writing score. That there's no conceptual way in which the two are somehow hierarchically related. And that's really different from doing this kind of factor analysis where your variables are truly conceptually related. So for example, nominalizations are related to nouns. You know, it's kind of like a special case of nouns. So you want to figure out, what do I do with that? Proper nouns are related to nouns, unless you distinguish common nouns from proper nouns. Something like, say you wanted to count the use of that complement clauses. Okay, everyone familiar with what I mean by that complement clause? So I think that today is Friday. So we have these that complement clauses. Well, that complement clauses are related to verbs, because every time you get a that complement clause, you have a verb. There's no way around it. So if you count the occurrence of verbs, and you count the occurrence of that complement clauses, to some extent, you've partially counted the same thing. So we've got issues. And those issues are really problematic from a statistical point of view if you talk to a statistician. Luckily, I'm not a statistician, okay? So because if I were, I wouldn't be doing this kind of analysis. I mean, it just is wrong. Right? I don't know if you agree with this, but
well, the tests stop you doing that.
Yeah, I mean, because these things are not independent, and they cannot be independent because language, grammar is not independent. You cannot pick any two features in grammar and have them be truly independent. There's no such thing, basically. So if you really worried about that, you wouldn't do this kind of analysis. My answer to that is that I've done these analyses, many dozens of times, and I get replicable results that are interpretable and that tell me something about language. They're very stable. And so my answer is, okay, maybe this isn't right, but it works. It's telling me something about language. And I think it makes sense from that point of view. Yeah?
I hope I didn't miss anything, but why can't you do like dimensionality reduction in some way with seeing like correlated features and reduce it?
Right, so that would be the statistical answer, but it ignores the real world reality. Right, so you can look and see statistically, I'm going to somehow do some kind of magic to try to deal with these correlational things. But the reality is these things are not independent. There is no way that if you count the number of dependent clauses, there's no way in the world it can be independent from counting the number of verbs. And this is massive. I'll show you some examples, but this is everywhere. And so all you can do is try to minimize that conceptually. And that's a whole separate thing from any statistical manipulations. In general, my feeling is there are a lot of statistical manipulations that we can do, and a lot of times they end up it makes it really hard to interpret descriptively what you've done, which makes it hard to interpret the results. And so I would prefer to stay closer to the surface and just recognize the limitations of what I've done, and then I can interpret what I've found. So that's kind of my spin on that stuff. All right, so just to kind of give you some guidelines for choosing linguistic features. So be inclusive, we've talked a lot about this already. You look at the communalities and factor structure. So what this means is when you start running factor analyses, say, like these days when I do a factor analysis, I start with maybe 150, 160 different lexical grammatical characteristics. And you start looking, and a lot of those characteristics, either they're too rare, so they just don't occur commonly enough, or they don't happen to correlate in meaningful ways with the other set of features in this particular discourse domain. So you start excluding stuff. And the way you do that is based on these things called communalities. So a communality is kind of like an overall correlation for an individual linguistic feature with the whole factor analysis. okay, the whole analysis. If that communality is too low, then you drop those features, and I'll show you examples of that. In general, I begin the features at the most specific level. If that very, very specific feature just doesn't work for some reason, then I'll look at combining features if needed to create more general features, hoping that the more general feature might figure into the factor analysis. So I'll give you some examples of that. This whole thing of the same feature, this is problematic because if you're using different taggers or different generations of the tagger, you could end up with basically the same feature and it just has different names. It gets counted twice. You would think, okay, that shouldn't be a problem, but it turns out it is. People don't pay attention to this, and this really is a mess for the factor analysis. So for example, back in the Quirk-et-al grammar, they had this semantic category they called public verbs. And unfortunately in my tagger from the 80s, well, maybe it's fortunate, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but I had this category in my tagger from the 80s that I called public verbs based on the Quirk-et-al grammar. And then when I rewrote my tagger in the 90s, and when I did the Longman grammar, we started talking about communication verbs. But communication verbs are basically the same thing as public verbs. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're pretty much the same thing. So you might get different counts for communication verbs and public verbs. If you included both of those variables in the factor analysis, they better come out on the same factor, because they're pretty much the same thing. But that's not telling you, in fact, it's worse than not telling you, it's actually perverting your factor analysis, because that's a correlation because you basically counted the same thing twice. So you really want to be careful of that kind of a problem. And then this whole thing of hierarchically related features. So, and this is like the most difficult of the problems, because there are going to be hierarchical relationships, but you want to avoid them as much as possible. So something like, if you count verb plus that clause constructions, so say you count verb plus that clause constructions, adjective plus that clause constructions, noun plus that clause constructions, and then you count total that clause constructions, well, you've got trouble, because you've counted the exact same set of things 2 times, right? If you add up the adjective, the noun, the verb plus that clauses, you add those 3 together, that's your total that clauses. So you can't include those things where it's 100% coverage of both twice. Again, it's going to correlate just because you've counted the same thing over again. So you really want to not do this. Is that there? Oh, there it is. Okay, and then as I said, these steps 3 to 5, this is linguistic factor analysis. Okay, you won't find this in other kinds of factor analysis, but it's the major problem that you have to deal with for this kind of factor analysis. So, how am I doing?
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
We'll have time to discuss things in the lab as well, and we can go over if so. We are quite flexible with it.
Okay, well, I'm not going to have you guys look at anything then. What do you think? Should I spend the 10 minutes on this, or should I go on and talk about like number of kind of introduce the other parts?
Maybe we can start with this, and then because we'll be replicating
And
it
then
step by step,
okay.
and we'll probably get there and see the interpretation.
Okay, so let me show you an example of each. So you guys have Yeah, I prepared all this stuff that you're not gonna, we're not gonna really do anything with, but let me take you through an example of each. So, okay, I'm going to show you an example of communalities, how the communalities works, and then I'll show you these kind of more or less specific levels, this including the same feature, how that can be problematic, and these hierarchically related ones. So communalities, and this is on your handout, but let me just show you here. So this is from a factor analysis. This is a factor analysis of a corpus of web documents. And I'm going to focus here on this feature right here. So this is causative adverbial subordinators. Okay, so just abbreviated as sub-cause. And these numbers here are what's called communalities. So communalities, just like correlations, they go from 0 to 1. And as I said before, so the communality is like a correlation of an individual feature with the whole factor analysis. So as the communality gets close to 0, you potentially have problems. Now this particular run that I'm showing you here, I've gotten rid of a whole bunch of grammatical features already. So what's left over here, this is basically what I keep at the end. And that's why none of these communalities are really close to 0.
So how did you come up with your initial list of your list of features?
I read a whole bunch. You know, this is like back in the very beginning, in the 80s. I just read every study I could get my hands on, how to do a speech and writing, saw what grammatical characteristics they were talking about. Then I went through the Quirk-et-al grammar, and I thought, that kind of sounds like one that might be useful, something like these public verbs and private verbs and so on. So just read tons. And then in my own personal history, by doing the Longman grammar in the 90s, where we looked at these different registers, then I came up with a bunch more features along the way. So I've just kind of been collecting lexical grammatical features over the years as I go along. So the idea is to be inclusive, because you can always, you will always, stuff is going to drop in a particular discourse domain when you do the factor analysis. But by being inclusive, you might discover parameters of variation that you wouldn't notice otherwise. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to focus here on these causative subordinators, because this is one of the lowest ones that are left here. So we have a communality here of 0.13. So kind of low. So let's look and see what that means. And the way I'm going to look and see what that means is I'm going to look at the actual factor structure. So in this case, I've extracted 10 factors. Okay, and I haven't really talked about how you decide how many factors to extract, but you make a decision. I've extracted 10 factors, but what I want you to see here is what happens. So what does a communality of 0.13 correspond to in the factor analysis? So the way these factor analyses work is that each factor is composed of all of the linguistic features, like I said, and you have these numbers. These numbers are what's called loadings. And the loading is basically the correlation of the individual feature with the factor. So each factor is this weighted combination of all of the linguistic features, and you've got this number, and this is basically a correlation that goes from -1 to +1. The scale here is -1 to +1. If you're close to 0, it means no correlation. If you're close to 1, it means very high correlation. So here, causative subordination you can see that most of these numbers are very close to 0. Right? 0.01, 0.01, 0.04, 0.07. These are all very close to 0. And the one exception is right there on this factor 3. We get a correlation of 0.3. So that particular feature is not contributing very much to this factor analysis. We have it's what we call it loads, so it loads in only one of the factors, and it doesn't load very strongly. 0.3, this is strong enough that we can still interpret it, so I would still include it in the interpretation of that one factor, but it's not very strong, not very important. And that's what happened. There's always this systematic relationship between the communalities and what you see in the reality of the factor structure of how it contributes to the factor structure. So that's how you can use those two to decide what features to include or not.